Today we're going to be looking at two uses for a multi-tap delay. So kind of a mysterious kind of a sound. We're going to be looking at adding rhythms to a beat. So inserting notes that weren't there before to add a sense of rhythm, and adding space to a beat. So there are great alternatives to reverbs, and they are often really excellent at creating unique stereo image shapes without all the extra reflections that reverb brings to the table. And then we'll dive into each specific case in a specific multi-tap delay that I chose to use. There are 3 delays being used. 2 of them are space delays. One of them is to add that extra rhythm. So let's go over the first one. So the first one I think is the easiest one to spot. It is on these beats. We only have 2 written, but you can clearly hear a third. Boom, 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 boom. And so I'm using the delay to add that in. There's also, if you're really astute, you can hear the stereo image is actually changing as well. You can hear something flinging back and forth between them. So I'm using the Tekturon by D16, and it's really visual. So it's a really great beginner delay. It's actually super advanced too. So it's great if you're really know what you're doing with delay as well. Basically, we have 16 delay taps. And what that means is we have 16 different delays. And so we have here just a bunch of options. And on each one of these different delays, we have the ability to insert volume. Only 3 of them are on, and we can see underneath the audible tab, 3 are on. These are basically on-off tabs. These are outputs. So I'm turning this one, only the output on or off. Where over here we have inputs, which will turn it off so it can't receive audio, so it won't output any audio, because the output's still on, but the input is off. See, nothing comes through. But if I turn it on, stuff comes through. But if I turn the output off, nothing comes through. Basically, we have our volume. Then we've got delay. Now, this is probably going to be the most confusing page if you're new to delay. But essentially, you choose how much you're going to delay by, like your unit delay, with this time grid. So right now it's set to 16th notes. It's on sync. We can add a shuffle to our beats, and the feedback's very important. But we can also tap in one. If we wanted to tap in a tempo, we could do that. But we're going to stick to the 16th note sync because that's what we want. And basically what this is saying is delay taps 2 and 5 will have 16th note delays. So that's how those work. Delay tap 1, which also I should mention is a special case, gets the direct sound. And delay tap 1 is the one that also outputs a beat later. So if we look at the delay, it's at ×4. What are 4 16th notes? Well, that's 1 beat. So this is actually 1 beat later. If we take off delay tap 1 and play it, there's no third, there's that na. We got rid of it. And that's because that's what delay tap 1, that's what this specific setting is doing. So extremely important to understand this page, and that's all that it's doing. So if I were to go up to like 16, it would come, but it would come just way later. How many later? 16th notes later. And if you have this in something like 8th notes, it can be a really long time, and you might think, oh, it's not working. You just have to sit there and wait for long enough. It'll come through. And again, it's dependent on your volume as well. Now we have here possibly the second most confusing thing inside of a delay. And if you can wrap your head around these two, you're gold for the rest of it. And this is feedback. So feedback opens up a path that allows feedback to occur. How much feedback can occur is dictated by this feedback master knob. So if this is off, no feedback will occur. it is on though, and so these values have meaning. So just because these are at 100%, normally that's like a huge no-no in delay. It is perfectly okay here because our feedback, our master feedback is not at 100%. And so we see there's some delay here. This is actually what makes it softer as time goes on. Well, actually, this is what makes it softer, but this makes it even softer. And then these two are also feedbacking. And if we look at our delay, these two are a delay of 1. So you might be asking, why do we have these? Well, if we go to the panning, one is controlling the left channel, one's controlling the right. If we actually look, we can see the left and the right. And these guys are responsible for the stereo image changing that we're getting. So if I take off delay 1 and just listen for the bouncing back and forth in 16th note like fashion. Hopefully you can hear that clearly. So you can hear them doing their thing. Now I might be saying the feedback's really high, so why don't we hear more of that? Well, this feedback isn't that high. If we actually pump this up. There you go. And you can see that could be a problem. So we're going to keep that where it's supposed to be reasonable. But that's essentially how this patch works. So it's called Boredom. I believe I'm using presets on everything. They're just really, really great presets, by the way. Not every delay I can say this of, but they have really well thought out presets. And you can see with a setup like this, you could actually treat this kind of like a sequencer too, with the right settings. So coming through here, let's turn delay 1 back on, or tap 1, I should say. We are able to pan individually. We already looked at that. Spread, this just has to do with stereo separation. So if you'd like to make it wider, you can do that here. Tap 1 is getting that treatment. And then we have a filter type. Now, in our case, this doesn't really matter. It's not doing anything to our sound really because our spectrum is already so thin in the area that we're in. But basically, we can choose filters. These are bandpass filters on 2 and 4. I think that should be on 5, not 4. But these aren't doing anything really. And then up here, this guy is the master filter. So that's actually referencing this guy up here. So if you want to use the master filter, that's what these are. You can tell though that it's off. So these are all off essentially. That's also what the MF stands for. We're able to change the cutoff of each filter and the resonance of each filter. And now you should be a master of knowing what all the buttons and knobs do. But what about the techniques, right? So we've already looked at this one. The cool thing about this one is that we've got the 1 beat delay and the 16th notes that create a stereo image, and then a little bit of feedback to make it work. So the feedback's low enough that it happens very quickly. It's not gonna ring on forever like I demonstrated. And that's pretty much it. So there's our first example, and we're using it to add in that extra beat. So let's take a look at another one. Now these ones are gonna get a little more subtle as we go along here. But our first one's actually on the vibraphone. So if we come over here, I have this vibraphone come in. And I should mention something about how I did this sort of songwriting wise. This sound at the beginning is very plucky, right? But actually a envelope opens up that smears the attack over time. So it gets more ringy, I guess. More like a bell instead of a pluck. That's what this does. And we actually see it comes back down here. The main reason I'm doing this is so that the vibraphone, it's got a very strong attack, right? So it's going to sound right away. And then this sound is going to ring out right after the vibraphone. So they'll fit together more like a puzzle. That's why I did that. There's also a filter opening and closing right there. Not a super big filter, just a small one. But that's what's going on there. And the vibraphone, very nice. So kind of a fun little line. If we look at what's going on in here, we again have a volume delay, but we see this one is sort of cascaded down one. And this is called denser subdivisions. Let's just go ahead and turn it on and off. Just use our ears real quick and just see if we can deduce what's going on. Now we'll turn it on. So it's really subtle. Well, I mean, it's subtle in a good way. Like you can definitely hear a difference, but it's not something that like is flamboyant and out in your way. It's much more of a mixing decision. Like if we listen, it's almost like a reverb. If we take it off, And now we put it on and just listen for the ends of the sounds and how they fade out and into each other. They last a lot longer, but they don't necessarily just completely overlap each other like a reverb would do. And this is the reason why we might choose to use a multi-tap delay. And so this is called denser subdivisions, but essentially what it is we have several delays on. Some of them are being fed back, some aren't, and they're at different times. And we're just sort of looking to strike a balance. Now, this is how we have it set up here. If we go to the delay page, we see actually a lot of them are at 2/16 notes, so an eighth note. So most of these are at an eighth note. A couple of them, or just one of them, is at a 1 beat, and then one of them is at 16/16 notes. So they're spaced out over time, which is what gives it a delay-like effect. And then we also have the feedback. Now we notice the feedback. Let's just check this out here. 7, 13, and 1. So let's go to the delay page. We've got 1, 7, and 13. We notice they are all the eighth note delays. And this is an important sort of takeaway. Because we're looking to emulate sort of a reverb, we're going to have our early reflections sort of ring out a little more, and then these later reflections will come in. And that's what gives it like kind of the transparent effect that it does, combined with the fact that they are echoing downwards. So very, very nice way of doing things. And then on the panning page, we have things being panned hard left and hard right. And this is just to create a cool stereo image. And so this is just a really great example of one way to create a delay that acts like a reverb, but is a lot easier to clean up and gives you a lot more direct control over the initial conditions of the space. If you open up a lot of reverbs, sometimes they'll give you controls over early reflections. That's kind of what we've set up here, is our own early reflection generator. And finally, the last one, if we listen here, could you tell where the other one was? So if you're listening, it sure does sound like the Celeste has something on it. It's again very subtle. I'm not necessarily sure I could point out some of these things, because in this case we have the notes written in all the time. If you were able to catch it, probably the high notes are what gave it away. And so if we look at the Tekturon on this one, again, we have a very similar setup. It's a spatial move again. If we take this one off, and then we put it on. So they ring out for a much longer time. And this is sort of more of a classical way that I think to use this. Let's break down exactly how this patch works. So starting us off here, we look at our volume and we see that it looks very, very similar to the previous patch in that things are decaying over time. There's a couple fundamental differences though. Like if we compare the two and their effects, let's just listen to this one real quick. And this one. We notice that things are not shifting between our ears like they were in the other one. And the ringing also tends to be just a little more dense and longer, as opposed to this one, which had a ringing, but it was very different kind. Like it was a much more mellow tapering off. So if we take a look at this, let's sort of see why that is. So first we notice the delays go down over time. So we expect something similar with the feedback, in that the feedback will be turned on in a way that'll make the sounds just ring out for a little bit longer. We notice globally we have more feedback. If we go and take a look at the feedback, it's actually up quite a bit. This is 100% pretty much on everything. And this is part of the reason why it's a bit denser as things get going and moving forward. The feedback's a lot higher. On the delay as well, it's uniform delay. So there's no difference in delay. And if we take a look at the panning, there's no difference in panning. So this one doesn't really mess with the stereo image. In fact, if we look at the spread, nothing really there. So this is just a true delay, just a regular old delay, except for the fact that there's a certain density that comes because each one of these has so much feedback. They each develop, or generate, I should say, their own discrete echoes. This one also has an extra little thing in there, which is kind of fancy and I thought was really cool. If we go to the filter type, we notice that pretty much everything except these two are on the master filter. So they have this guy. And if we look at the cutoff for each of them, we notice the cutoff is actually darker and then opens up across the delay. So there's this interesting idea of shaping the spectrum over the delay lines and the resonance as well. The resonance turns off. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because the resonance is already so low, but you know, that's going on. So a difference in spectrum across the delay line, along with the fact that the delays are all uniform and the feedback is pretty high. The major difference comes in the fact that the volumes just go down over time. So for example, the last delay, even though it has a high feedback, it's not going to contribute quite as much. And if we look at the cutoff, it's actually the brightest one. So it's almost like kind of counterbalancing this, but this one's going to have a lot more say because it's a way louder. And so what this ends up happening is we get a more mellow sound, but there's still some brightness in there just because if we look at this, it's also this first one's being filtered heavier. If we look at the cutoff, it's being brought down more. So it's really sort of an interesting patch. And this would be something that given a different input might sound very different or a lot more pronounced, that is. But that's how those work. So there you go. You've got 3 patches here, 2 of them for creating a space, and the last one for adding a little bit of rhythm. Hopefully this gives you some ideas and insights on how you could possibly use a multi-tap delay in your own productions. And if you end up using the Tekturon and make something cool with it, drop it down below. I'd love to hear what you made. Subscribe and have a blessed day.